talking about operant conditioning. Discovered by behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner, operant conditioning is a method of learning that occurs through reinforcement, so rewards and punishments for behavior. Skinner identified two types of responses: reinforcers, which are responses from the environment that increase the probability of a behavior being repeated. Reinforcers can either be positive, presenting the subject with something that it likes, or negative, removing or avoiding some aversive or painful stimulus. Punishers are responses from the environment that decrease the likelihood of a behavior being repeated. So some examples from my own personal life to kind of help explain this theory further. So an example of a positive reinforcement would be when me and my siblings were younger, when I was about maybe 10 years old, we had a system in place in our household, in our family, where if you did something well, or you did what you were supposed to, or you got a good mark, or anything that my parents wanted to reinforce and make the likelihood of it happening more, we would get marbles, little marbles, and each child, so me, my brother, my sister, we all had a jar in the kitchen, and we would get a marble every time we did something, and then could use those marbles for, I don't know, like a treat or a movie or whatever. But the marble was the positive reinforcement because it is giving the subject, so me and my siblings, something we like in order to increase the likelihood of a behavior happening. Now, for a negative reinforcement, this one's a little tricky because it's still a reinforcement, so it's something that increases the likelihood of a behavior, but it's negative because it involves removing or avoiding an aversive or painful stimulus. So an example for this one could be when I'm at my mom's house. I know whenever there's clean laundry put in my room, my mom's going to ask me, nag me, yell at me until I put it away. So I've kind of just developed now that whenever I see laundry, I put it away before it gets to the point where my mom's yelling at me, because then she's in a bad mood and I'm in a bad mood. So the negative reinforcement is her kind of nagging at me, but me putting away the clothes without being told to do so in order to avoid the aversive stimulus of her nagging at me. So an example of a punishment is something that decreases the likelihood of a behavior being repeated. So something like when I was younger, being sent to my room for misbehaving in some way. So being sent to your room is something, or was something that I didn't like, and teach me that, okay, well, when you hit your brother, you get sent to your room, you get a punishment, so then next time I'm less likely to do that same behavior. So furthermore, there are primary and secondary reinforcers. Primary reinforcers are unlearned, innately reinforcing stimuli, such as one that satisfies a biological need. So for example, getting food when you're hungry. So hunger is the primary reinforcer and getting food is the response. So you were never taught to be hungry, you were never reinforced kind of this way or that way. You just know, as we do, that when you're hungry you get food. So the primary reinforcer that was not learned or taught is hunger, the feeling of hunger, and then the response to that is getting food. Secondary or conditional reinforcers are learned through association with primary reinforcers. So for example, being praised by your parents for getting good grades is a conditioned reinforcer. So grades objectively don't mean anything, but their association with praise increases the likelihood the behavior will occur. So from my experience, my parents kind of are always happy and make me feel good when I do well on something, and that kind of praise or that feeling of good makes me more likely and more motivated to continue that behavior and get good grades and do my work. So moving on with Skinner's findings, so there's reinforcements and punishments which influence behavior, but there's also a thing called reinforcement schedules, which is a pattern that defines how often a desired response will be reinforced. Continuous reinforcement occurs when the desired response is reinforced every time it happens. For example, getting praise every time you clean your room. However, continuous reinforcement eventually becomes less reinforcing, so there's a need for partial schedules of reinforcement, where behavior is reinforced only some of the time. these schedules of reinforcement are generally more resistant to extinction than continuous reinforcement. So there are 4 types of reinforcement schedules that involve 4 main terms. So fixed refers to being consistent. So after a consistent number of times, consistent amount of responses, anything consistent is fixed. And then there's variable, which is the opposite of that, so inconsistent or kind of unpredictable. It's not really every 5 times. And then there's the ratio, which refers to the amount, and then interval, which refers to time. So if that was a little confusing, now I'll just explain the 4 schedules. So there's the fixed ratio schedule. So as we said, fixed means consistent, and ratio refers to the amount. So this fixed ratio schedule refers to when positive reinforcement occurs after a consistent amount of responses. Okay, so an example of the fixed ratio schedule would be something like when me and my siblings were younger, we would kind of, or I guess each at our own time when we went through that stage, but come out of our room in the middle of the night, wake up our parents, kind of that type of thing, just not stay in our room when we're falling asleep, which I'm sure was annoying to our parents, and we weren't getting good sleep and whatnot. So our parents came up with a plan, and they put up like a blank calendar on the wall, and we would get a check mark every night we slept through the night. And once we got 3 consecutive nights in a row, we would get a sticker, and then after a certain number of stickers, you'd get a prize. But the fixed ratio schedule is that after consistent amount, so every 3 nights, you'd get a sticker. And the sticker is the positive reinforcement because it increases the likelihood that we will not come out of our room. So moving on to the next schedule of reinforcement is called fixed interval schedule. So where the fixed ratio schedule focused on a consecutive number of things happening, so 3 nights in a row, fixed interval refers to a consistent amount of time. So reinforcement after 1 week or after a month or any interval of time. Okay, so an example of this I can kind of apply to my life is that I get an allowance from my parents every week. So every Friday you get $20 as long as I don't do something really bad. Like I said before, if I don't put away all my laundry, or if I'm mean, or if I spend a lot of money that week or something, as long as I kind of do the minimum and do my chores at a fixed time every week, I get a sum of money, and that money is the reinforcement. So the next schedule is called variable ratio. So this refers to when the reinforcement is delivered after an average number of responses. So the number of times it takes to get the reinforcement changes. Okay, so an example of a variable ratio reinforcement schedule would be something like gambling or lottery, which I've never personally experienced, but I've observed and definitely is applicable to kind of not everyday life, but life. So the variable ratio schedule means that, for example, in a slot machine is programmed to give out a prize maybe, I don't know, once, I don't know how it works, but let's say it's once a night. It's not like, okay, every 5 times someone plays, you get a prize, or it's not like, okay, once they play 3 times in a row, they get a prize. No, it's a random amount, and it changes, and it's not necessarily predictable, but there is kind of an average. So the last schedule of reinforcement is called variable interval, which refers to when responses are reinforced after a variable amount of time has passed. So an example of this could be when I'm at work, for example. One of my managers is very kind of adamant about us not just kind of standing around and doing nothing, and kind of wants us to always be cleaning or fixing stuff or organizing things or whatever it might be. So if he comes down and he sees that any of the cashiers are just kind of standing around, he'll get mad, and, you know, you kind of not get in trouble, but you don't feel good about yourself after. So what I try to do is kind of always be doing something and just constantly be, you know, like dusting something, wiping something, walking around, looking at stuff, so that if he happens to walk by, I'm not going to get in trouble. So that's an example of variable interval because I don't know when he's going to come by, but at whatever time he does, I want to be doing something that is going to get me the reinforcer of being praised or not getting in trouble, I guess, would be a negative reinforcement in this case. And that's basically that, and that is how the schedules of reinforcement and types of reinforcements and punishments and all that apply to my personal life.